Hello, my name is Barry Arrington. I'm the Chief Legal Counsel for the National Association for Gun Rights. And today we're going to be talking about an amicus brief that I filed in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals out in California, challenging California's total and complete ban of suppressors. Now, the case is Sanchez versus Bonta, and we filed this brief supporting the plaintiff's challenge to that total ban. And we've come up with some pretty, I think, interesting arguments that I think that the members of NAGR and the public might want to know about. And today we're going to go over the arguments that we made in that brief. Now, the first argument we made had to do with going all the way back to when the National Firearms Act was passed in 1934. Interestingly, it was passed in June of 1934. And 1 year prior to that, there was a movie that came out, June of 1933. And in that movie, the producers used a plot device where the evil bad guy ran around shooting people with a revolver with a suppressor attached to it. And the sound of the suppressor was kind of like this. So you see that the movie magic, or the movie myth, if you will, was such that the suppressors on that revolver sounded like blowing air through a straw. Of course, that's absurd. Everybody knows that that's not how suppressors actually work. They make guns quieter. They don't make them quiet. And as a matter of fact, that's doubly absurd because anybody who knows anything about firearms knows that suppressors don't generally work on wheel guns, revolvers at all. There's a couple of exceptions to that, but the far and away the rule is suppressors are working for semi-automatic weapons, not revolvers. So we have some movie myth-making going on in 1933. We have the National Firearms Act being passed in 1934. And if you go to the legislative history of the National Firearms Act and you try to find out, well, why did they think suppressors were a problem? That they had to be regulated at the national level. So you dive into the legislative history of the National Firearms Act, and you're expecting to find some congressman or some senator saying, these are awful, these are terrible, they're used in crime. Instead, you hear this. Literally, nothing. There is nothing in the National Firearms Act legislative history, and it's over 100 pages long, that suggests why Congress thought that this was a problem. Now, obviously, they thought that it was that suppressors were somehow connected to crime, and so they regulated it. Was it a result of the movie myth-making that we saw? Maybe. Nobody knows. That's the point. Nobody, 90 years later, nobody knows why Congress decided to regulate suppressors. So that's myth number one, that Congress knew what it was doing when it regulated suppressors. Myth number two is that suppressors have been demonstrated to be associated with crime. Suppressors have never been associated with crime. There certainly have never been a legislative record showing that they're associated with crime. As a matter of fact, just the opposite is true. The assistant director of the ATF is on record in 2017 saying there are about 4.5 million registered suppressors in the United States, and we know how many suppressors, or at least legal suppressors, there are, because every single one of them has to pay the NFA tax, and there has to be a separate transaction with the NFA on every single one of them. So they have really good records on how many there are. Well, you got 4.5 million of those out there. How many have been associated with crime filings? About 40 per year. So you got 0.0001%. I don't know if I got enough zeros there, but you get the picture. They're just not associated with crime. As a matter of fact, the ATF director said that even most of those are not actual violent crimes, they're paperwork problems. And so you've got myth number two busted, that suppressors have ever been associated with crime. What is the next issue? That the person who invented the suppressor was somehow trying to do something nefarious. Well, who invented suppressors? You're probably going to know this name, Maxim. Now, it's not the Maxim that invented the machine gun, the Maxim machine gun. It's his son. And the Maxim that invented the Maxim machine gun went deaf, right? And his son invents a suppressor to try to reduce the noise level of the suppressor. Now, here's an interesting fact, little known fact, that when Congress passed the National Firearms Act in 1934, they referred to this device as a muffler. They did not use the word suppressor. They did use silencer. They called it a silencer or a muffler. Well, why would you call a suppressor a muffler? Because that's what the inventor called it. And so Maxim, and this time we're talking about his son, his name was Hiram Percy Maxim, invented the suppressor in order to reduce noise in the neighborhood when he was target practicing. And here are two of the advertisements that Maxim had in the early 20th century. One is for a car muffler, and the other is for a automobile muffler, both of which he calls silencers. The interesting thing about this is that the technology that Maxim used for the car muffler is pretty similar to the technology he used for the a firearm muffler, and he called them both silencers. That was kind of marketing hype, because we know that putting a muffler in a car doesn't make it silent. Putting a muffler on a gun doesn't make it silence. But Maxim was a marketing genius, and he said, well, we'll just call them silencers, and that will increase sales. And that's how the word silencer became associated with more properly suppressors. Now, what does a suppressor do?
Firing the same ammunition to show the difference between unsuppressed and suppressed. The suppressed guns are quieter, but still so loud, ear protection is still a good idea.
What we saw and what that newscaster said was it reduces the sound of the firearm, but it doesn't make it silent. As a matter of fact, you probably still should have ear protection, even with a suppressed weapon. Mufflers, so-called mufflers, silencers, suppressors, never made firearms actually silent. They just reduced the noise. And that's their purpose, to protect the users, their hearing, to protect the community, to reduce the amount of sound that your neighbors are going to hear if you're practicing with your firearm. And it's the same reason that states require mufflers on cars. Every single state has a statute. And this, we point out, California's schizophrenic attitude towards mufflers. Car mufflers are required because we don't want loud cars disturbing neighborhoods. But California, while requiring Maxim's car mufflers, prohibits Maxim's firearm mufflers. How does that make sense? Well, it could make sense if California could make the legislative record that these suppressors are somehow associated with crime, but they never even have attempted to do that because they're not associated with crime. The final thing that we point out in our brief is, get this, Europe is way ahead of us on this. European nations, while it's way more difficult to get a firearm in the first place, to get a firearm license, for instance, in the United Kingdom, but once you get that license, there is practically zero additional regulation of suppressors. And the reason for that is they're actually affirmatively good thing under the European law. For example, I'm about to read from Great Britain's regulation of suppressors. Sound moderators, which is their term for suppressors, are often used when shooting game, deer, or vermin. In the case of the latter, they might facilitate more effective or less intrusive pest control. They're appropriate for reducing hearing damage to the shooter or to reduce noise nuisance. For all these reasons that I've been talking about. Listen, this is not Barry Arrington, Chief Legal Counsel for the National Association for Gun Rights, position that suppressors are an affirmatively good thing for a number of reasons. This is the United Kingdom's law. It's just beyond belief that Europe, which has generally a more restrictive attitude towards firearms, is actually much less restrictive when it comes to suppressors. So there has been a movement at the national level to deregulate suppressors. Certainly, there's no reason to regulate suppressors at the national level. No one has ever even tried to make the case that suppressors need to be regulated at the national level. Leave each state to regulate them as they see fit, and then let each state try to make the case that it's necessary to regulate them. California couldn't, and nobody can, because the fact of the matter is, as the ATF's deputy director said, they're not used in crime. Very rarely used in crime. So get involved in this fight. We have a petition drive at the National Association of Gun Rights to Pam Bondi, urging her to actually get the DOJ involved in stopping the suppression of Second Amendment rights in the United States. I'd also like to give a shout out to William Kirk at Washington Gun Law, who did an excellent video on this very topic about a week ago. I recommend that highly. Thank you very much for listening in.